It's your open source advocate, and I wanted to do a video about putting everything together that I've kind of been showing you guys over the last year, really using the tools that we just kind of seem to repeat every time so that you can always come back and reference this video if you need help. And really we're going to start with Docker, and then right under that Docker Compose. So these two guys are related. Sometimes we just run it straight up out of Docker, sometimes we do a Docker Compose and bring things up, especially when there's multiple containers involved that we want to have networked. But these are really important to a lot of the stuff that I show you, especially self-hosted things. Really, once you get used to Docker and Docker Compose, it gets a lot easier. After that, then I definitely want to talk about routing. So depending on how you run these things and where you run them, if you run them in a VPS, you route your traffic to that in one way. And if you're running it on a server at your home that's behind your home router, then you want to route traffic in a slightly different way. And then no matter how you route that traffic, the next step is really something like NGinx Proxy Manager, which I really like. This is a really great project that somebody made so that they could make it easier to set up NGinx without having to do a bunch of config files, and really gave you a nice GUI to work from. So this is a cool project, and I use it all the time, and I highly recommend it. It does work, and it works really well for the most part. There's a few situations where it's not the ideal tool, but for the most part it's been really great for me. And then finally, using these things in combination and knowing how to get to this point, once you're inside your network, or if you're on a machine where NGinx Proxy Manager is running and you have a bunch of virtual machines running on there through Docker, you really use this to point to either those separate machines on your network that are running different services, or to the different Docker instances, if that's what you want to consider these things as well. So really, this is kind of what I want to talk about. I see a lot of people do kind of PowerPointy type videos. I promise this is it. We're at the end of this one, and we're going to get started on this stuff. So we're going to start with Docker and Docker Compose, and we're going to talk a little bit about what these are, and then I'm going to show you how to install them on a Ubuntu or Debian-based system. That's kind of what I use for the most part. So if you want to install this on Windows, they have kind of a wizard where you run like it through a normal graphical install. Mac OS X, they've got an installer that you can run. If you want to run this on other Linux distros, just go out there and look. There's instructions on how to install them on all of them, I promise. I just happen to use Ubuntu and Debian, so that's what I'm going to talk about. After I do this part, then we're going to talk about routers and VPSs, whether you're working inside your network or you're using something like DigitalOcean or Linode or SSDNodes, or just tons and tons of others out there that have their their VPS setups that you can use. Once we've kind of talked about routing, then I'm going to do a piece on NGinx Proxy Manager itself. 1, installing it, and 2, actually setting it up and using it to help you get to these services that you're running in Docker. So I mean, really, this could almost just make a loop back to here. So you start here, you route through here, and then you use this to kind of loop back around and get to it from the outside world. But by the same token, inside your network, you could have multiple machines running things, and this is your gatekeeper. So you have a firewall. That's your first set inside of your router, and you just want to forward ports from the firewall only to this NGinx Proxy Manager server, and that's it. And then let it do its job and let it route the traffic and decide, is this a valid request or not? So that's kind of what we're going to talk about. So a lot of people ask, what is Docker? The simplest thing I can tell you is Docker is a virtualization system for servers to run web applications or applications. So when Docker first came out, I really didn't get it either, and people didn't explain it super well for me, so I'm going to do my best to explain this for you. But if you think of having a physical machine that you can walk over to and push the power button on, and then maybe you have an entire rack of machines that you can run over and push the power buttons on, and each one of those machines runs some other website. Maybe you have a WordPress site, maybe you have a Ghost blog, maybe you have a Discourse site, maybe you're running who knows what, right? Just any kind of different servers or services that have web front ends, especially. Think of that being in a rack system. Now I want you to imagine that you take that rack system and you say, you know what? I'm going to take all of these separate servers and I'm just going to combine them into one really good server. So now you've got one server, but it's running a bunch of different services, and there's lots of ways to do that. You can try to split those things out using virtual networks and virtual LANs and all kinds of crazy stuff. But what Docker does is it says, hey, we get it. You want to run things a little bit easier, and you want to run them on a virtualized server, and you want it to just have the bare minimum things that you need to run that service. So think of Docker being that rack that you're going to mount those servers in. So here, this is your rack, and each one of these little containers, as they call them, is a server. Okay? So that container can actually hold more than one server, but let's just assume for now that it's a server. So when you run Docker on anything, when you run a Docker container, that's your server. It's running in a virtual system, in a virtual rack, basically. So one of the best ways that I can imagine to kind of show you this is to show you a Portainer install. So I'm going to go out here to my Portainer that I run on SSDNodes, and this is just a front end GUI for Docker. It's really nice. I have videos out there on it, and you can go find those. They're really easy to find on my channel. But you can have multiple Portainer instances on actual different servers that you can look at from one as well. But I'm just using this one, and you can see I've got 19 containers. So when I open this up, imagine this is my rack. This is all of my different servers in my rack, and you can see that they're running, that they're on, or that they're stopped, just depending, and I stop them sometimes on purpose. They'll tell you if it's healthy, if it has a health check capability, that kind of stuff. So here I can see all of the information about ports that they're running on and what their IP addresses are and what, you know, just all kinds of information about these different servers that I'm running inside of this Docker ship. And each of these containers is on my ship. So that's what Docker is. Docker is just a vessel to hold all of your different servers, or you know, in this case, containers running different applications. So sometimes you have an application that needs more than one container. So for instance, NGinx Proxy Manager actually uses 2 different containers. There's several containers. So WordPress uses 2 different containers. So as you look down through here, you'll see different things that are running. So Jitsi, I think Jitsi uses 4 or 5 containers. So I'm not running all of these as separate servers. Some of these are one server, but it needs multiple containers to really run because those applications use multiple different kinds of services and systems to make them run. So when I talk about Docker, that's what we're talking about. We're going to take Docker and we're going to set it up, and then we can start running our different containers. So I'm going to go spin up a DigitalOcean server here. All right, we're going to create a droplet, and we will get in here and actually just use this Ubuntu 2004 is fine. $5, and I'm going to keep moving down. I'm going to pick New York. That's close to me. You should always pick one that's physically close to you. We'll keep moving down. I'm going to do a password, and it's going to ask you to create a password, and they have some rules about passwords. So when you create your password, just make sure to watch and make sure you get a nice strong password and that you have all the boxes checked here. If you don't, then it's not going to enable the create button. And then we're going to call this docs.opensourceisawesome.com. Let me double check my spelling. Yeah. And we're going to move down. I'm going to hit create. So when you give this name, if you're ever using DigitalOcean, if you're going to give it a URL, go ahead and use the URL for the host name that you want as well. So while we're waiting on that, I'm going to go over to DigitalOcean, install Docker Ubuntu 20.04. So that's the way that I do this. I just search for it. It always comes up as the top hit. And then we've got our instructions right here, and I'll make this just a little bit bigger so it's easier to read. And really, I just go through and highlight and copy all of these things. And what I've actually done is I've created a script. So now when I do this, I just push the script up and run the script, and it does all of these commands in order, and I don't have to run through and do them one at a time. But if you're doing this just once, you can absolutely just highlight and copy. So let's go back to our DigitalOcean here, and now we have an IP address, so we're going to copy that, and we're going to go here and we're going to say SSH root at, and we're going to paste in that IP address. We're going to say yes. Permission denied again. We'll give it just a second because it may still be setting up our passwords. So if you ever get this, just wait, 10, 20 seconds and then try again. There's nothing wrong with being a little patient. So to try again, just hit the up arrow key on a Linux terminal and it'll refill the stuff in. I think Windows actually does the same thing. There we go. Now we get our prompt. So type in your sudo password. There we go. I'm going to clear that out. So the first thing I always do is sudo apt update sudo apt upgrade -y, and I let that run. Now I'm logged in as root, so I don't need sudo, but it's just a habit to type sudo, so don't sweat that part. But this is kind of step one, is just make sure that your system is up to date. So you want to update and run the upgrade part. So the update says go get all the packages. Upgrade says and install those packages for me. So we're going to let it run that real quick, and then we'll continue. Alright, our update's done. It installed a lot of stuff, and it took a little longer than I've normally come to expect, but that's okay. It installed a couple of kernel updates, so that's good. But after you run the update, you should always do a reboot. So we're going to do sudo reboot. It's going to boot us out of here. We'll give it about 20 seconds, and then we'll log back into it. And then we'll be ready for the next part, which is install Docker and Docker Compose. And this again is really just copy paste. It's very straightforward. I've got it on a lot of my site as well as a lot of my pages out there on shownotes.opensourceisawesome.com, so you can get it from there. But you can also just create a script that you keep, and that makes it a lot easier. So I'll show you how to do that as well. Yeah, it's ready for us. That's one great thing about DigitalOcean. I mean, the reboots are just so fast. Okay, so in order to install Docker, really what I do is I just come out here. Now we just did the update, so we don't have to do that step again, but I just copy these things and just Control C, and then I come back to the terminal, and you can middle click on your little mouse wheel in Linux, and that'll paste it. Or you can do, and I'll show you this too, when you paste or copy in the terminal, you have to use Control and Shift. So in this case I'll do Control Shift and V like Victor, and that pastes it in as well. So either way, whatever makes it easier for you, and then we'll run this command here. So I'm going to put a -y, that way it doesn't prompt me. It'll just install these things. And it's really quick, so that was fast. Okay, so we did that one. Now we're just going to come down here and get this curl command, and make sure to include that little hyphen there at the end. We're going to do a Control C, copy, and then Control Shift V to paste. Done. It doesn't take any time. It just gives you a little OK. And then we're going to go here, and we're going to add the repository. So make sure you grab everything when you copy. And then we're going to paste that in. And it kind of does its own little update, but it's good to go ahead and rerun the update after this. So we're going to do sudo apt update one more time. And that's even in the instructions back here, right there. And then we're going to do this one right here, the apt cache policy. So we'll copy that. We're going to come back in here, and I'll clear this so it's easier for you to see. We're going to do that one. Okay, it's all done. And then we'll skip right down here to the bottom where it says sudo apt install docker ce. This one's the one that we really want. And yes. Alright, Docker is installed, so technically we're done, but there's more that you can do to make it easier to use Docker as well. So if you just do docker-v, you'll see the Docker version that's installed here. Now we can clear this out. So the next step is down here as well, and it's good to do this, especially if you're not logged in currently as the root user, which you shouldn't be technically. So going down here under step 2, which they say is optional, grab this little command right here. Just copy it, and again, paste it into the terminal. Now, if you're logged in as root, it's not going to matter. But if you're logged in as the non-root user, what this does is it adds your user to the Docker group, which means whenever you're trying to run Docker commands, you won't have to use sudo. So this is done. Now, as root, you don't have to run it as sudo anyways, but if you're logged in as your normal user, then this makes it so you don't have to use sudo to run the Docker commands. It just makes it a little bit simpler is all. It takes out a little typing. Finally, we want to install Docker Compose, so that is just sudo apt install docker-compose, and then just do a -y, and it won't prompt you. It'll just go and do it. And this one's usually a pretty quick install. And now we can do docker-compose-v, And there's the version of Docker Compose that we have. So we've got everything set up now for using Docker and Docker Compose. So we can clear this out. You can do Docker PS, and it's going to show you nothing because we haven't actually started any Docker containers, but this is how you would list the running containers on Docker. So we're done. Docker's installed. You're set. You're ready to go start running some Docker containers. Now that's a whole other thing, and I've got lots of videos on all kinds of different Docker things you can run, how to install them, how to set them up. So get out there and you can watch those things. But the next thing we want to tackle, or that I want to tackle, is how to deal with your network or your VPS so that you can have a domain pointing to those servers, because it's important to have that and know how to set that up. You may not be ready to create the domain yet, but I want to talk about it. Alright, I want to talk about how to set up a domain, first of all, from your domain registrar, if you're going to run something like we are right now, like in DigitalOcean or Linode or SSDNodes or any of those VPS systems, so that you can get your own domain name and point it at these different servers or services you're running. And a lot of times you want to set up not only the domain name, but a subdomain that allows you to run things like that. So I own this domain, opensourcesawesome.com, and I use Hover for setting this up. But it doesn't matter if you use Hover or Gandhi.net or GoDaddy or whoever. So as long as you can get in there and set the settings for DNS and things like that, this is going to apply to you. So the first thing I'm going to say is, if you're just going to run a single subdomain or a single domain, you just need to set up an A record for that thing, and it's just easier. So you go into your DNS. Now it's a little different for each system depending on who you use, but you should have DNS options that you can go to, and then you should have an option somewhere that says add a record. Now it may say add a record, like A. In this case we have A, it just defaults to it, but here I have also 4A, CNAME, MX, TXT, SRV. Okay, I think GoDaddy even has more than that. But what you really want is the A record. So remember, we set up the name docs.opensource well, we just want docs. So in this case, I'm just setting up a subdomain of opensourcesawesome.com. So I'm just going to tell it this is docs. It'll know that's going to be docs.opensourcesawesome.com. I'm going to go over here to DigitalOcean. I'm going to copy this IP address again. And then I'm just going to paste that into the IP address space. And then I'm going to set this to 5 minutes. Now just different domains like GoDaddy sets it down. I think 30 minutes is the fastest you can do unless you pick a custom time. And then I do 10 minutes sometimes. But Hover lets you do 5, so I pick 5. Then you just hit save. Now what you should see is that you should now have an entry in your list that says docs, and it should have the IP address that you pointed it to. And it'll take about 5 minutes for this to update DNS, and depending on who you're getting DNS from, it could take longer than that. You know, they're doing their best to push that out as fast as they can. So now you've set this up, which is great. So I can get to that server, and it's going to go to that IP address. But if I actually try to go to that address, I'm not running any servers there. So docs.opensourcesawesome.com. It's not going to give me anything. There's no page to go to. That's okay. That's what Docker's for. We can run a server inside of Docker to get to a page if we want to. So we've set up our subdomain, which is great. This is how you do it. Now this is if you're running out on a VPS. So let's say that I'm not running on a VPS, and that instead I'm running on a server at home that's inside of my firewall. So your router should be running a firewall for your home network. First thing you need to do is know how to do port forwarding on your router. And I can't tell you how to do that because there are 1,000 different makes and models of routers. And every brand has a slightly different user interface, but there should be something. Let's just look at Linksys. They're a popular brand, right? Something that lets you do port forwarding on your router. So if you look at this, here's a video on YouTube. I don't want to use somebody else's content. That's not cool. Let's see. There should be images. I clicked on videos. That's why I got that. Yeah, here we go. So in Linksys, this is kind of what it looks like. You basically go in here and you say, hey, I need to forward a port, and I want to use UDP or TCP, and all that means is UDP says I send a signal and I hope that it made it. TCP means I'm going to make a connection and stay connected to that other endpoint as long as I can. So usually the instructions for what you need to forward will tell you. In the case of 80 and 443, just set it to both and don't sweat it. But you tell it, I need to set 80 and 80 for my ports here, so the same. So it's just setting one port, 80 to be whatever you want. And then here you tell it what your IP address is for the machine you want it to go to. So that's how you set up port forwarding. And what that says is, when I get a request at my home's public IP address for a website, if it's on the right domain and the right port, which is 80 or 443, I'm going to pass that through to a certain machine. That's all it's saying. It says if I get a request on port 80, it's going to pass that through to a certain machine. If somebody sends a request on port 81, this firewall should bounce that back and tell them, I'm sorry, you can't get in. You don't know the secret knock, right? 80 is the secret knock, or 443 is the secret knock. 81 ain't good enough, it bounces it back. So that's kind of the best I can do, and the reason I say these are all different is because they are. So if you look at, let's just look at NetGear. Here's another popular brand, at least here in the US. I don't know what all the brands are for everybody else in the world. But yeah, so NetGear, it's a little bit different page. You just, same thing though, it's port forwarding. And you want to put in, again, the ports you want, so 80, and then where does that point to? And you put in the IP address of the machine on your local network that you want that to go to. So you have to do port forwarding. Eero is even different because you can only run it on your phone. You can't even get to it through a browser, so they're all different. All right. So let's just say now that I want, so I have a domain I run at my house called routemehome.org. So what happens when I go to routemehome.org is it automatically forwards me to my home IP address, my public IP, and then when it hits my firewall goes, oh, you asked for something on port 80. Okay, let me pass you through to the machine that's running the NGinx Proxy Manager, which is kind of the next step that we have to get to. And NGinx Proxy Manager says, hey, you asked me for routemehome.org, but I don't actually have an entry for that. I just have my plain old main page, so it just tells me, hey, you reached me. Good job, that's it. I could type anything in here that is not already a domain that I run. So I could type in anything.routemehome.org, and I'm going to get the same page. Until I type in something that is a domain that I'm running on my machine, you're just going to get that. So if I type in analytics.routemehome.org, now I'm going to get a login page because NGinx Proxy Manager says, oh, you asked me for something I recognize, let me forward you to that particular machine, to that server. In this case, this is a server that's running Docker. Okay, so I want to talk about setting up the NGinx Proxy Manager. That's kind of our next thing, but port forwarding is important if you want your home router to work. So we're going to talk about routemehome.org real quick. So what I did was I created an A record, just like you saw a while ago. I created an A record for routemehome.org, and instead of putting in an IP address or a host name, I put in star. So just the asterisk, that's it. And then I put in my home's public IP address where it says IP address, and then I hit save. And what that does is it tells the DNS system, like, hey, anything comes to, in this case, routemehome.org, go to this IP address. So let's get into the installation of NGinx Proxy Manager next. So this is the GitHub project site of NGinx Proxy Manager. And right here, I just like to go to the quick setup page. And it just tells you right here exactly what you need to do. So this is a little small, don't worry. I'm going to make it a little bit bigger for you guys. You're just going to copy this text right here. I'm going to copy it. And I'm going to go back to my server that I'm running right here. I'm going to clear this out, and I'm going to say, make a directory called npm. You can call this NGinx Proxy Manager, you can call it whatever you want if this confuses you because there's no package manager and some other ones, right? In fact, let's call this nproxy. How's that? I'm going to move into that directory. Now I'm going to create a file. I'm going to use nano config.json. Make sure you spell this correctly. And in here, I'm going to paste that text that I just got. Now I have to change some of this stuff, okay? I don't want to leave these defaulted to this. This is not safe, so you want to change this. So the database name, you can call this whatever you want. You can leave that npm if you want to. But the user, let's call this Brian. And the password, let's just give this a better password, okay? PASSW0RD1, exclamation point, okay? So that's not a strong password. You should not use that password. You should pick a really strong password that has upper and lowercase letters, numbers, and symbols, and is not a word, okay? Not even based on a word. But for our purposes, this will work. Now, you want to remember what these values are, okay? This is important because you're going to use these in the next step. But to save, I'm going to do Control-O, and then I'm going to check the name. I'm going to hit Enter if it looks good to save it, and then I'm going to do Control-X to get out of Nano. Now the next part of this is I need to create a Docker Compose file. So I'm going to take this whole section right here all the way to the end. I'm going to copy it. I'm going to go back into my server, and I'm going to say nano, and this time I'm going to call it docker-compose.yml. Okay, this is going to be a YAML file. Again, Control-Shift-V, like Victor, to paste. Now you see right here, there are a couple of things we need to change because we changed this on the config file, so I need this to match. Okay, and this I changed as well. So anything you changed, you need to update it here. Now the last thing is on the config file, we did not set the root password, but here we're going to set it, and we're going to set it to something strong. So just, whatever. Okay, something strong. Now this is assuming that we can use all of these characters for MySQL. I don't know about the semicolon since it means something in MySQL, but there we go. That's not based on a word, it's a strong password. I don't need to know it, so that's important. Up here, this we definitely want. Do not change these. 80, 81, and 443. Whatever machine you run this on, you need to make sure that your host allows these ports and that they're not already used by something else. Okay, so these need to stay the same. Sometimes I tell you to change these values. In this case, you should not change these values, and you should make sure that these ports are available on this machine. There's nothing else in here to change, okay? Everything else stays the same. We're going to hit Control-O, check the name, docker-compose.yml, make sure it's spelled correctly, and then hit Enter to save. Control-X to get out of that file. Okay, we're done. Now, we're going to run this to get NGinx Proxy Manager up and running. So we're going to say docker-compose up after the space and then -d. So just like this, and then we're going to run it. Alright, when it's finished you should see something like this where it says db_1 and app_1, and they should both have a done next to them, and you're going to get an ID for what's running. Now, you can check this to see if it's running by doing docker ps. And here we can see that they're running and how long they've been running. So that's good. That's what we want. It's kind of a mess because the terminal's so big, but it's there and it's running. It's not empty anymore. So now, if I go to, and we'll just open up a new tab here. If we go to docs.opensourceisawesome.com, we get the congratulations page that NGinx Proxy Manager takes us to automatically. Now if I want to get to the actual configuration page, I would do :81. This is going to bring me to the admin page, and here the first time you need to do admin@example.com and CHANGEME, change me, all together. Log in. Don't save that because you're going to change it anyways. Now you want to put in an email address that makes sense. Save it, and then you want to put in the old password, CHANGEME, change me, and then put in a new password that's strong, and then save those changes as well. Once you've done that, go over here and say, no, I don't want to save it right now. Go here to your admin, click sign out, and then sign back in with your correct credentials now. And if you get logged in, you did a good job, everything's up and running, you're ready to add hosts to NGinx Proxy Manager. Now people have asked me, how do I secure NGinx Proxy Manager itself so that other people can't just get here and it's not a secured page, so you can see that? Well, this is how you can do that. You're going to set this up with its own subdomain. So we're going to go back over here. So what I want to do is I want to go back into hover and I want to add another entry. So I'm going to create an A record and I'm going to call this manage docs. How about that? And I'm going to give it the IP address from DigitalOcean that I got earlier. There we go. I'm going to copy that. I'm going to paste it right here, and again I'm going to tell it 5 minutes, and I'm going to save it. So now I have managed docs, and it has the same IP address. Now you could have just created a CNAME and pointed it to here. It's fine either way. It's just less to update if this IP ever changes, but it's a static IP, so I don't expect it to change. Now that we've got that, we're going to go back to NGinx Proxy Manager and we're going to add a host. So we're going to go into the host section. We're going to say add a host and we're going to create this one. So this is manage docs.opensourceisawesome.com. There we go. Okay, so now that I've got this in here, I want to go find out what the Docker IP address is for this server. So in order to do that, I'm going to try ifconfig. It may not be installed. It's not. So you can install ifconfig if you prefer to use it, but I can just do ipaddr show and then docker 0. It's going to show me the docker 0 stuff, and here's what I want. This is the IP address that I want to copy. So I'm going to copy this. Control-Shift-C to copy. I'm going to go back to my browser. I'm going to paste it in there. And then this is definitely running at 81. So that's the port that I want this to go to when I go to this site. And I'm going to say block common exploits. And I'm going to hit save. So I just want to test and make sure this actually works. So I'll click it. And there we go. I got right to my page like I expected, which is great. So I'm going to close that tab. I'm going to go in here now and I'm going to click on this 3 dots and I'm going to hit edit. And I can make this a little larger for you guys. I'm sorry about that. So I'm going to go over to SSL now. And I'm going to say I want to request a certificate. I want to force SSL whenever this comes up. There's a new option that I haven't seen before. So that's cool. It has my email address already in it from where I logged in. And I'm going to say I agree to Let's Encrypt certificate terms of service. I'm going to click save, and it's going to go out and run a challenge to see if it can reach the site through port 80 so that it can issue the certificate for SSL. If it goes away with no errors, you should be good. You can just click here again to make sure that it opens up, and now it is secured. Okay, so no more going through this route. Now I'm going to use the secured route, and Brian at right there, and fill in my correct password for this thing that's strong. There we go. Now you can tell it to save if you want to, if it's your machine, but you'll see you have the one host. So now you can come in and you've got that secured, which is great. Okay, so that's how you secure NGinx Proxy Manager. You kind of create inception. You secure it to itself. Kind of a cool little trick, right? But it really works. So we've got NGinx Proxy Manager set up. Okay. The reason that I did this is because I don't want this going out and coming back to the public IP address. I want to use the internal address on the server, and since NGinx Proxy Manager is running on the same server as my Docker, I'll just point it there, and I'll do the same thing for everything else I install through Docker on this server. I'll just point it to this address and the correct port number, and then that will get everything routed the correct way. So as I assign more new different domains and URLs, they're always just pointing to this machine inside of this internal Docker 0 network, and everything can get secured that way, and there's nothing going back out to the internet and back in. So that's NGinx Proxy Manager. Now, if you're inside of your own network at your home, so I'm going to log into a different one here, and this is going to be my local one. And on this one, I don't have it forwarded. I just use it like this because it's inside my network, and I don't forward port 81. You should not forward port 81 in your network. Only 80 and 443. So I'm going to log in. And here you can see I've got 6 hosts. So on my internal network, this is the only machine that's not part of that server that I'm running NGinx Proxy Manager on. But that's okay, because what happens is when I go to the URL here, NGinx Proxy Manager gets the request on my main server, and it says, oh, you want this other machine. Let me send you over there, and it sends me over to that machine at the correct port, and then I get a nice secured connection to this URL. So it's running inside my network. It never goes back out to the internet, so it's all secured inside my network behind my firewall. So that's how I work this. And you can do this too if you want to run servers on different machines out of your home. So that's the way that I put everything together, and that's kind of the same thing that I do every week when I bring you a new video, especially when it's something that's hosted. Now sometimes I'm just giving you an application that you just install and run. Sometimes I'm going to give you an application that there's not a Docker image or Docker container out there yet for. But most of the time, if there's something available on Docker, that's the way that I'm going to try to run it, and that's the way that I'm going to set it up. I'm going to set it up in Docker. I'm going to give it a domain name. If I set it up at my house, it's going to have the wildcard routemehome.org already, and I'm just going to use NGinx Proxy Manager to create a new subdomain that I'll use to access it. I don't even have to go create an A record in that case, because the A record says for anything that's not specified, go to my home IP address, which is awesome. After I've got that set up, I've got a secure site to a server that I'm running inside of a Docker container, inside of my network, and everything feels so much more secure to do it that way. The old way of saying, oh, I've got this machine over here and I'm going to run this server on port 2731, and I'm going to open that port up on my firewall, and now I've got a machine over here and I'm going to run that, I'm going to run that server on port 10822, and I'm going to open up that one on my firewall. Suddenly you've got a firewall that's basically open for anybody to try to get into and do stuff with. So I really like using the NGinx Proxy Manager route for my home network, especially because I'm only opening 80 and 443, and NGinx Proxy Manager handles all those requests that come into that, and it says, oh yeah, you can go over here, or oh yeah, you can go over there. Really nothing extra or anything special to be done there. NGinx Proxy Manager handles it all. So that's pretty great. So this is kind of the way that I will do anything and everything moving forward, unless it's an application or unless there's not a Docker container available for it. And even then, the only modification we make is how we install the server. Once the server is installed, I'm still going to use a proxy manager to actually set up the domain and make sure that I'm getting my SSL certificates and everything like that. So we'll go through that stuff when we hit that. We'll jump off that bridge when we get to it. But I hope that this is really helpful to you. I hope that you enjoyed this video. I hope you get a lot out of this video. If you do, please like, subscribe, tell your friends about it so they can come along on the journey with us, and I'll talk to you next time.